Okay, it's
Oh,
6.
actually, the
No?
recording will start.
Okay. Let me know when it starts then.
I believe we're all set.
Okay, it's 6:08 p.m. I'll call the meeting to order. And right away, I want to ask one big favor of those of you who are remote. Please check around and find your hand raise function. And if you want to speak, I'd much prefer you use that for two reasons. Sometimes I don't actually see a physical hand. And the other reason is if you use the hand raise function, it lists people who raise their hand in the order they raised their hand. So it helps me figure out who to call on next. So please, if you can find that function, please use it. All right, and the first thing we have on the agenda, as usual, is a public comment time, and we actually have some public tonight. Sir, do you want to identify yourself for the benefit of the other folks and let us know what's on your mind?
Yes, my name is Eric Salat. I live in Manchester, and nothing in particular. I was reading the August 18th minutes.
Let me just find out whether people who are remote can hear you. If you can hear the speaker, okay, good. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Not very well.
No, not very well.
You can
Oops.
sit in that chair right there,
Okay.
which is connected, and then you're closer to the microphone.
Yeah.
But let me unmute it.
Oh, yeah.
Got all this stuff. I can't do that. Okay. There you go.
Okay, sir, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a couple questions. Last in the August 18th minutes, you said you conducted an equity audit. I was just wondering if that was completed and is it available for people to see?
So we have not, we're going to start it. So
Oh, you
that's
haven't
going to be
started?
the work that we're doing this whole school year. So there'll be a presentation at the end of the year. Probably the Taconic and Green Board, but possibly the BRSU board, in which our findings will all be shared with the public.
I see. And it also mentioned that there was the teachers, the staff was provided a course during the year.
They will be.
Is that available for people to see what the course content was?
Yeah,
I
so
think that's
last
in the
year,
future, isn't it?
well, last year we had a series of like modules, training modules that we
Right.
did with staff. And so it was a way to sort of build some common understanding with the staff. They're not public necessarily, they were like a series of concepts, but if somebody was interested, we'd certainly be willing to share what we did.
Okay.
So if you want to connect with me, I'm Randy Lowe, I'm the superintendent. We can connect, I'm happy to share with you and put you in touch with somebody who has access to all of it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Was there a particular reason why you ordered an equity audit?
We wanted to identify whether or not we have inequities within our system that we should be looking at. And it's hard when you're sort of in the middle of it to necessarily see all of that. So we wanted to look at curriculum, we want to look at our practices. We want to just sort of have an overall global understanding of our system.
I see.
And if I can add a little bit there, one probable inequity we identified a couple of years ago was that in some of our schools, it probably made more sense to devote funds to things like parent school coordinators, people to help with families who really were having a rough time, and therefore their kids were having a rough time, rather than, for example, make sure that every seventh grader could take French, which means that what's ideally being offered at each school isn't necessarily the same thing. And I think part of the idea of our equity study is to try to figure out what does the population of each school need that maybe the other ones don't need as much, and how do we adjust for that?
Right. Yeah, well, that leads me to the next question. Like, suppose you had a student, an honors student, and you were hopeful that he was the son of some doctor or something. This is all hypothetical. And they wanted to move them along quickly academically. Could they be assured under this equity program that that could happen?
I'll let Randy speak to that
Yeah,
first.
so-
Assured is probably a little strong.
So what we're really wanting to, our whole system is designed on this concept of a personalized system. And so regardless of where a student is, we want our system to be able to meet them where they are and help to ensure that they have meaningful growth. So whether a student is performing above grade level, at grade level, or below grade level, we're working towards having a system that is highly responsive to that. So kids can be engaged in a meaningful way, have high levels of learning wherever they are.
I see.
Because learning is necessarily tied, especially at the K to 8 level, with like a content area or grade level.
Right.
So we want our system, and that's part of the work we're doing, we have been for the last few years, is really developing and shifting towards a more personalized instruction, a personalized program for our students. And this process should really help us to identify where are we doing that really well and where are we not really doing that well for all of our learners.
I see. So equity doesn't necessarily mean all the same.
No, not at
Right,
all.
there's a distinction between that and
The
equality.
outcome being all the same.
Yeah,
That's correct. Because we know in any one of our classes, we have a really diverse group of learners.
Right.
And so, so if we just teach one thing to the middle, we're probably not really meeting the needs of many of the kids.
Right.
So, yeah.
and Dick would like to add something.
The principle of equity is something that the board developed definition about 2 or 3 years ago. And it's part of what we are about. The distinction between equality and equity is an important distinction. Equity is defined. You'll note in tonight's agenda that the board wants to take a closer look at whether or not we need to expand or modify that definition, and whether or not the board wants to make this a policy rather than just being defined as something that we are vitally interested in. The principle of equity is what we're interested in. And it's in the BRSU stuff, and we used to publish it right at the top of every agenda, but we stopped doing that a while ago. So equity is an important aspect of making sure that we individualize education and give every child the maximum opportunity to be as successful as they possibly can be.
I see.
Thanks, Dick.
It is defined on your website, the board definition of equity, so I guess that would.
Right. The thing that's a little incongruous is that we have a definition, but we don't have any policy that explicitly applies that definition to something or other, and that's one of the things we'll be working on this fall.
I see. Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much for taking my questions.
Well, thank you for
Appreciate
coming. It's a rarity that anybody shows up nowadays.
Look,
Invite the rest of your public.
I will.
Yeah.
I'll do my best. Thank you.
Randy,
Yeah.
you want to turn that?
To be fair, this is the first in-person meeting.
And you can
Other
turn
than
this back
repeat.
on.
Okay. The next item would be the consent agenda.
I move the consent agenda.
Okay. And just a reminder, if anybody does not want an item on the consent agenda, now's the time you have to say so. And again, please use the hand raise function if you can locate it. Don't see any hands up. Is there a second to Dick's motion? Seconded by Melanie. Okay. All those in favor, please raise your hand.
John,
It's
is your
unanimous.
hand?
Okay. All right. The consent agenda is approved. Next item would be the minutes of the policy committee, which is
I
for
move-
voting only by the policy committee.
I
Dick has a
move the
motion.
acceptance of the policy committee minutes of August 26, 2021. And only the 4 of us who are currently on the policy committee can vote in favor or opposed. One of us has to, somebody else has to second the
Right.
motion.
So could a policy member committee please second Dick's motion? Okay, Deb is. All right, the policy committee members in favor of that, please raise your hand one way or another. I see Dick, I see Deb, I see Melanie. Oh, that's right, Jane's not here. Okay.
She was.
Oh, she was?
I would also like to point out that because Melanie is very, very busy with a large number of things that are exerting themselves in her life, she has decided that perhaps she can give up the policy committee. And so if there's any other board member who would like to join the policy committee, please send your name to Herb, and we'll make sure that that will be an appointment that he makes, or we vote on as a board.
Yeah. Okay.
Melanie, do you want to talk?
Melody, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we voted to approve. Did we actually vote to approve that just now?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Then I won't add anything.
Okay. Just one minor thing I have a question on. The minutes say that Celeste is going to renumber
That didn't happen.
the policies. Okay, that didn't happen. Okay, I wasn't sure.
Will happen eventually.
Okay, that'll happen eventually. All right, next thing is to review the board norms and goals, and this is different from just our usual reading of them because we postponed from the last time whether we needed to revise them at all. They are on packet page 7.
Start with the norms first.
Yeah, let's take the norms first. That's the top of packet page 7. Dick, do you want to speak to them?
We've had these norms since obviously June 2019. We've evolved as a board, and at one point, a couple of board members have said that they would like to tinker with some of the words a little bit, and this is now the opportunity to do that. I don't see anybody jumping. Then I move that we continue as stated the board norms adopted in June of 2019.
Okay. Excuse me for just a minute. I've got to find a way that I can get everybody's face on my screen because something just readjusted itself. I'm not seeing 3 people here.
If you grab, oh yeah, it's spotlight view. Click on the 3 dots and then
I
change
tried
layout,
that.
and then do auto.
Oh, auto. Okay.
Yep.
I thought auto.
And then if you drag that over a little bit.
Yep.
Yep, you don't, yeah, that's
Okay, I
right.
don't need that many
No,
people. Right.
that's fine.
Okay.
And then close it up.
John, I saw your hand go up.
I have no idea.
No, it's still not working.
Updating.
Did you have something to say?
Yes, I will. I recognize her.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think more so, I saw Ben's hand up, maybe has some ideas about the norms themselves. I think more, maybe a more precise way or a way for us to assess ourselves and less of a binary fashion, to what extent are we respecting time? To what extent are we following protocol or speaking to the point? Just maybe not every meeting, but a way for us to evaluate ourselves. Maybe a quick self-report evaluation at the end of every other meeting, whatever it may be. So again, not so much about each specific norm, but how we're measuring ourselves against the norm is my suggestion. Something for us to think about.
Again, folks, I apologize. Just go ahead and have the conversation with Dick because I cannot get my screen to show everybody.
Ben, I see your hand.
Thank you. So I think I was one of the people who have mentioned tinkering in the past, and I'm not sure that it's necessary or not, but I thought I'd bring it up anyway, just to pull back to that moment. The SMART goals strategy, specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, time-bound. There are a couple of different, there are some other versions out there that are of, very similar frameworks. And one is to make it a SMARTY goal, adding an IE on the end. And that framework adds basically it adds inclusion and equity onto the goals framework. So it asks, as we're setting goals, to ask the question specifically, who is affected by this decision, who is not part of the conversation or the decision-making process, and do we have an opportunity to include their voice in that conversation? And equity is really, we address that in our goals statements, and our, through our operational definition of equity, and using that definitioning as a guide in policy and development decision making. So we do that already as through our goals, but it's another way of framing it within our sort of day-to-day process. So I don't know that I didn't come with a specific proposal to amend that, but I'd sort of put that to the group if that's of interest.
Jane has her hand raised.
Herb, you're muted.
Actually, this one's muted too, okay.
Go ahead. Now
Go ahead, Jane. I believe
Jane,
you're
you're
I think you're
muted.
muted, Jane.
She's not. Sound needs to be turned up.
Jane, either you're muted or your sound needs to be turned up.
I think she'd have to fix that with her settings.
There you go.
Would it be possible, Herb, if she wanted to write it in the comments and somebody could read it out loud for folks listening?
Yeah, Jane. Yeah, Jane. If you'll put that in comments, I can get to the comments. Jane, have you typed a comment? I'm not seeing one yet. I'm looking at the right screen, aren't I?
Yeah, if she types something, yeah. But Mel also has her hand up, so you can.
Yeah. Melanie, while Jane is typing, would you like to say something?
Sure. I would just like to second the idea that Ben put forward. Rather than reiterate, just say I think that's a great idea.
I'm still not seeing a message from Jane.
Okay.
Try it.
Okay.
Oh, there she goes. Now we can hear. Go ahead, Jane.
Great. My husband was just fixing it for me because I don't know what's going on. Having to use a different phone. Yeah, no, I'm just glad, Ben, that you added this, because I was actually sitting here thinking I'd like to see equity be like in our minds at all time. And I really like the point about thinking about who the stakeholder is when we engage in policies and so forth.
Okay. Anybody else want to speak to the issue here? Dick?
I wanted to say that I made a motion, it wasn't seconded, but the motion would now include SMARTY goals with inclusion and equity being the IE, or the norms. John.
I'm sorry. I'm a little confused. Are we talking about the board goals or the norms?
Norms.
Okay, so were you implying that those Smarty goals framework should be applied to the norms or the goals, or both?
It's,
Within the norms that we already have in the norms, we'll work to set goals for our work that are smart, and then it defines
Okay.
what that is. So I would just amend that to include the
Okay,
IE.
I understand now. I'm sorry.
David,
I'll second the motion.
okay. Any more discussion of it? I have a sort of an overarching question that applies, I guess, to both the norms and the goals. It seems that they partly overlap our policy governance policies. And I wonder when we revise the norms and the goals, whether we should either acknowledge that some of them are the same as policy governance policies, or simply omit them because they're already policy.
Since we read these at every other meeting, and most people don't read the policy manuals, it really synthesizes what I think our ultimate goals and ideas are. So I believe we should revise them and continue to read them.
Anybody else want to speak to the motion? Don't see anybody using the hand raise feature. And again, there are 4 of you whom I cannot see despite my best efforts here. So please do use the hand raise, because if you do that, I'm alerted to it. Don't see any, however. So all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. All right, that appears to have passed unanimously. Great. Okay, next item would be number 6, which is first.
Wait, it's with goals.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Yeah, I skipped over the goals. Yeah.
So again, same process. There has been some commentary that we'd like to revise the goals, whatever. And so some proposals would be in order, I guess.
So if you have a proposal, use the hand raise, please. Okay, Deb?
I like 1 and 2. I was going to suggest that we have goals that address those issues, because those 2 things have come up over and over again. One is looking to the future, and the other is community engagement. So even though we haven't reached those goals, I think it's important to keep them in front of us. They were frequently cited through all of our policy work.
Anybody else have a comment? Again, please use the hand raise. John?
I think, I'm kind of more, as far as goal setting here and looking at our Smarty framework, these goals we have now are great. I think they seem to me more like core values, and I don't know how much they, how much they impact our, board, our meeting to meeting decision making. I'm personally, I think I'm in favor of more short-term goals that are a little bit more concrete. And this is not a motion, but for an example, one would be a goal that, in the coming months, we begin exploration of regional middle school, right? Something a little bit more concrete to guide us, thinking of vision versus mission, right? So we have these, overarching policies that drive our vision, and think of the board goals as our mission. What are we doing now? So I'm in favor of a more short-term, concrete, tangible goals, and I would be in favor of a goal of starting to explore regional middle school.
John, would that differ necessarily from the work plan that we get presented every so often?
The work plan, what isn't that more that we're making sure that we're returning to specific policies and adjusting those, and or am I wrong about that?
Well, it strikes me that the work plan has space for listing something like the months in which we, for example, want to discuss a middle school. So I'm not sure whether we need to create something else to remind us. Randy, I think, wants to say something, and then Melanie.
Yeah, sorry, my hand's not up, but I guess part of me, I commented in my superintendent report about that. So this might be an area that is, what is my lane and what's your lane as a board? Is your lane to direct that work, or is my lane to determine whether or not there's a need and bring it to the board for you to discuss with you? So, yeah, that's it.
Okay. And then Melanie, who isn't necessarily speaking to that particular point, but go ahead.
I'd actually speak to both of those. One being regarding that, I mean, I think if we are to continue with our community engagement and we recognize that there's discussion at the community level about a middle school, I think that would be something, we should bring to you, right? So that at that point, it does become in our lane. I would think, that's up for discussion, but more importantly, I think to John's point earlier, while I love that idea is that we're talking short term, I think that we're talking about a whole nother process of goal setting and goal accountability. If we have short-term goals like that, where we would have to, actively be setting goals, I would think almost at every meeting, and then going through the process of, did we achieve that goal, again at every meeting. And I don't know if that's the level that this board goals, I don't know if that's a level that we as a board want to go with these board goals. Right now our agenda is consistently pretty full. Setting board goals could be a whole nother, that's a solid discussion. So that's what I consider.
Anybody else want to speak to that? Okay, thank you, Jane. Jane, in the future, please try to use the hand raise, because otherwise I'll miss it.
You did it.
Oh, I'm sorry. She did now.
I did use the hand raise. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened then.
No, it wasn't showing on my screen for some reason.
Okay.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So I just was going to say, John, I can appreciate your point. I think, one of the differences I think about perhaps what you're talking about, I think is, when it comes to thinking about goals, and I think that maybe what you're stating or suggesting is more like an objective that becomes part of goal setting, a way that you measure the goal. And I think that that's part of what in my opinion, I think that's part of what our board is also hoping to get better at with the self-assessment, and so I tend to like the idea, what you were saying, that maybe the work plan in essence is our objective, if you will, that is equivalent to part of meeting that overall goal, because objectives and goals are different and they can get confusing, and a lot of times I think a lot of people really do have confusion in the difference between an objective and goal. And then, like, speaking to Melanie's point, I think that it can get really confusing if we were to try to get into that level of definition.
John.
Thank you, Jane. I think I probably should have said this to begin with. Looking at evaluating whether these are SMART goals or not, or even SMARTY, are they specific? Maybe they are enough, or measurable, maybe. I think that, are they time bound though? Like what, that's the T in SMART. Like, are these time bound whatsoever? And maybe I'm just missing the underlying, time bound piece. So if someone can speak to that.
I would just point out that the work plan, of course, does give a schedule. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, John, I hear you. I'm hearing what you're saying. It's making me, I appreciate that you're bringing this because it is making me consider these goals anew. And what I'm thinking as I'm looking at them now is that these are annual goals that, on an annual level, that's the time frame. It's like we're going to revisit these goals in another year. And so what are the, and then within the time of that year, we're going to set more specific, measurable, attainable goals within those categories over the course of the year. So we know we're going to do more community engagement work, and we're going to have to define out what that looks like. And then there'll be some accountability with that specific work within it. And then we can look at the end of the whole year, we ought to be coming back to these goals and say, how do we do in the area of governance, of community engagement, of equity, of legislative action or awareness, right? So, so that's the way I'm looking at it, and it's actually helping me to add the IE, the SMART-E element of it to say, how do we get some other voices into conversation around governance and around equity, around legislative action, like that we're not necessarily hearing. I mean, that's sort of the point of community engagement, is to hear those diversity of voices and get that in there, but not in the other areas. So anyway, that to me helps frame these in a way that makes sense, and knowing we'll have to specific ones beyond that.
Deb.
Deb, go ahead, and then Melanie.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, I agree. And I think that the intent at our annual retreat is to do just what you said. Look back over the goals. Did we achieve them? Did we not? What do we need to do next? But somehow we just ran out of time for that this year. So maybe we need to be more careful to give that a higher priority, at our annual retreat. We don't have time tonight to do it either, but that's a job for the annual retreat.
Okay, Melanie's next, and I'm going to encourage someone, maybe the gentleman on my left, to make a motion after Melanie has had her say.
I was just going to add to that at our annual retreat. There is some discussion of reframing the questions next year, and maybe we should really look closely at the tie between these goals and what questions we ask when we evaluate our board, and make sure that they are completely connected. And if we're not getting the evaluation results we want because we're not asking the right questions, then that means our goals are not the right goals.
Right.
Dick, would you like to make a motion to focus us a bit?
Yeah, I would make a motion that this has been a useful discussion, but in the absence of something more definitive, that we adopt these goals as continued annual goals.
Okay, is there a second?
I second.
Seconded by Dave Chandler, okay. Any discussion? David, you had your hand up before, so.
Yes, I was just going to say that I believe that technically John is absolutely correct, but that I've been always looking at these goals as almost, in a governance terminology, almost policies, that they should reflect our overarching approach to things and our values, and that our work plan and our agenda that we generate every week should be the ones that really gets our business done. So I don't think we need this additional step, and that's why I support Dick's motion that we just accept these goals, because I think we're starting to get our work done. It took us a while to get incorporated and get behind the policy governance approach, but I think we're starting to get there.
Bearing in mind we have a lot on the agenda, is there any further discussion on Dick's motion? Seeing none, then all in favor, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Looks like it passes with opposition. Okay.
Don't you have to mention who it?
Dave, your hand is still up. Is there something else you'd like to say?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. Okay. All right. The next item would be to adopt the ends policy 1.0, which is packet page 8. Dick?
We actually, at the retreat, adopted 1.0, but because there's a word that's been changed that I think may change the meaning of 4.0 or 1.0, we've brought it back to be revoted for the adopting 4.1.0.
Yeah, I think that's you added reasonable at the last
Yes.
meeting when you approved it, so now you're adopting.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Then I move we adopt 1.0.
As written on
As
page
written.
8. Yeah, okay. Is there a second? Seconded by Melanie. Okay. Any discussion? Remember, adoption is the second phase. Once we've adopted it, then it's there, it's a policy. Seeing no discussion, all in favor, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Not seeing any hands on opposition. That passes unanimously then.
And I think that the communications group has now made a proposal that we've been given in our packet, and they probably should conduct a discussion.
You mean on packet pages 10 and 11?
Well, the 1.1, 1.2,
Yeah.
1.3, and 1.4.
Which are on package pages 10 and 11, yeah. Okay. Somebody want to speak to that? Or, well, Dick, would you just mind making a motion?
Well,
that
then I move that we adopt as
approve.
Excuse me. I move that we approve the ends policies as listed. 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4.
Okay. Is there a second? Seconded by Ben. Okay. All right. Now for discussion, would anybody who helped revise these and add 1.4 like to speak to them? Ben.
I'll start, and then please, Deb, Mel, anybody else, John, jump in on this. But we had a really productive follow-up meeting after the retreat to look over the different recommendations that folks had made through email and other comments, and we incorporated some of that language into these revisions that you'll see here noted in yellow and bold, and some recommendations we opted not to include, and some of those were based on, for instance, there was some language within the equity literacy piece that we opted to leave as it was, because it's part of it, that language is part of an existing framework that's in common usage within the Vermont Superintendents and Principals Association and various schools around the states. That's a known and understood framework within that community. So, and we left some of those pieces in because this will be part of our ongoing sort of education and learning as a board and as a larger education community. We did the one significant change and add is adding 1.4, which reads meaningful engagement with and integration of the dispositions, academic achievement, and social, emotional, and personal learning. Students will demonstrate the diverse range of skills and dispositions in 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 through relevant, engaging, real-world applications. And that was a synthesis of some opinion that had been shared with our subcommittee, or our little community engagement committee, and also at the advice and consultation of our superintendent, Randy, who felt that this was an important piece to add because it's the synthesis of all of these dispositions, academic achievement areas, and the social, emotional, and personal learning into a real world context, so that students we're actually creating learning experiences, intentionally creating learning experiences and opportunities for students to demonstrate that they're proficient in those areas in real world contexts. And that by adding 1.4, that then gives Randy the framework to work with the teams to build that into her program. So I don't want to speak more to that, but that was the big add.
Right. And we, can I go ahead? Ben, can I speak to that or not? No?
I don't know where Herb went.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. So just like the 1.0 at the retreat, we approved 1.1, the up to 1.3 social emotional learning. That was our charge to sort of look at that. And one of the concerns had to do with life skills, because a lot of people mentioned life skills, but we decided that actually adding 1.4 addresses that concern, because if they are demonstrating skills and skills that have real world applications, those are life skills. So that was how we addressed that concern that several people had given us.
Jim? Jim, go ahead.
There it goes. Okay. I guess I just have a slightly different take on that based on the nature of the life skills that people were raising as something we should be providing to our kids. And I thought the nature of those skills that were, came up on a frequent basis from the community engagement was a different type of skills that aren't necessarily captured in my view in the current ends. So I think it's, those are real life too, but they're real life with a very different nature than, for instance, look at, the 1.2 academic achievement, list. So I still would sort of advocate for, I wouldn't die on my sword over it, but I'd advocate for something, the life skills being financial and, day-to-day skills.
I'll call on Melanie in just a moment, but following up on what Jim said, remember that these, I believe anyway, are ends policies for students only through 8th grade. And I'm wondering whether any of the student representatives would have any opinion about whether 1.4 as drafted fits that. But go ahead, Melanie, and then Jane, and I'll see whether Sam has anything to add. Melanie,
we talked on the life skills quite a bit, and kind of even went deeper than we would be charged to go, right, with as a board, as opposed to what Randy's work is. Specifically, I was talking about financial literacy, because I know that came up a lot. And, financial literacy is part of the curriculum in mathematics, I think all the way through. So to that ends, as like I said, it's kind of way more specific than we need to get, but it kind of satisfied my need for that financial literacy part, knowing that mathematics that is taught up through 8th grade is going to be dealing with money sums and how to, maybe not building a checkbook, but knowing how to, at least understand and work with money. I know it's like a really vague way to describe that, but, and some of the other stuff, the physical education, health and wellness, I mean, all of these things, are kind of built into the curriculum. And since we felt like life skills was, we don't have a measurable sense of what life skills is either. It made it kind of hard, I feel like, for us to put it in just as a blanket statement of life skills without any kind of a definition. It's not a truly understood term, I don't think. I think it has a lot of different meanings for a lot of different folks. So where we, so landing on it, and that people were going to apply all the things that we've put in here, including health and wellness and mathematics, also social emotional development, landing on that they're going to use all of these skills in applications that will apply to their life was kind of how that solution came about. If that helps at all, I mean, it's only to say we went there with some of these and figuring out how to measure them and put them in a way that wasn't micromanaging the curriculum that Randy uses was a little challenging.
Jane, you're next.
Yeah, I agree with Jim on this. I guess there's a couple things. First of all, I've taught life skills groups, and part of what I have to do in evaluating people for disability, which these are big conversations with people in vocational rehabilitation and with developmental disabilities groups. And, part of that life skills really is evaluating what's called activities of daily living that looks at functional ADLs, instrumental ADLs, and executive ADLs. And I just have to say, although I think some of these things, like Melanie, what you're saying, that they're taught in curriculum, I think that one of the things that I think we're missing, or I'm concerned about is here we were given very specific feedback from the community about something they really want to see. And I think that this was a huge thing that the community really spelled out. And so maybe if we feel, what I'll say to that is, I don't know for sure how well we're teaching all of that. If we are, maybe it's a thing of we're lacking in how we're communicating that curriculum to the community so that they can appreciate that it's being done. But I just have to say, I think that there's a gap here that somehow we're needing to reconcile, because I don't know. I'm not trying to be critical of curriculum, but somehow we're hearing feedback that I don't think we're really reconciling, or at least maybe we think we're reconciling it, but I don't think we've reconciled it in our communication to the community, because actually they keep, they've already given us the feedback that they want to see life skills. So.
Ben, and we have some other people wanting to speak too.
Yeah, I'll be pretty quick. I think, it just, again, we did spend quite a bit of time on this and took some advice from Randy in crafting that language. And part of it was thinking about what's age appropriate to be teaching to students, and where does that already exist in the curriculum. And I think the point being that the community was talking about this, that's really valid and important, and saying that, that's something that people care about. I do really question whether that's something that people are really caring about at the high school level versus the elementary and middle school level. And I think I shared a story within the context of our small group meeting, and it may help to give it a really abbreviated version, but because part of what Randy was talking about in this real world application is creating space for a capstone-like project for 8th graders to really demonstrate what they've learned over the course of their time in our schools in the context of addressing a real world issue that they care passionately about. And I shared an example of a middle school, another middle school in the state, where students worked on a project where they had used the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to try to understand, what are the issues in their community, and then they developed a project that would address those issues within their community. And their project was they created a co-op where they raised chickens in the school, they created arts and crafts, and they sold what they produced, and then took the proceeds from those sales and donated it to local groups that were supporting the issues that they'd identified that their community needed support with. So that process, they learned a tremendous amount about how to balance a budget, how to handle money responsibly, how to communicate effectively with adults. That was the real world application of things that they'd learned over the course of their time, right? And so that was appropriate because they were engaged and it was relevant and it was real world in that context. But that's the sort of thing that I think can emerge and can be quantified to a much greater degree once we have space for that kind of work to happen. So this wasn't, this language was a that came out of that dialogue that we had as a small group on stories like that, and trying to figure out how do we create space for that, so that Randy, so at an appropriate level, so that Randy can work with her teams in schools to then meet those goals.
All right, Deb and then Sam.
We had a couple different discussions that I'll relate. One is that the life skill that was frequently cited by in the survey was just financial life skill. They wanted kids to be able to balance their checkbooks and their credit card accounts. That was the life skill that they were asking for. It wasn't every life skill. But the other thing we considered, some of you gave us the advice that we shouldn't include life skills unless there were standards and a curriculum for presenting it. And at the same time, later today, we're going to see Randy's evaluation. And I was on I'm on the BRSU board, and one of her goals for this year is to take a hard look at our curriculum, to revamp it, to make it consistent across grades and up through the grades. And we see that as a huge project, and that to add the responsibility for her to create a separate life skills curriculum is just probably something we should give her space to do later, because it's just not, they're going to be really, when you hear Randy explain her curriculum goals, you'll see that it's going to be a big project. So we shouldn't try to micromanage that process by injecting another requirement.
Okay. Samantha and then John.
I won't talk for too long. I would say when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I barely knew what a credit card was and what it did. And I understand life skills. I grew up cooking at my house, but especially financially wise, I got my first real job in high school, and I didn't really have to manage money. I was fortunate in that way, but I think most kids are in the similar boat. Now that I'm in high school, I definitely wish that BBA had offered. I know they take, I have friends who take microeconomics, but I think that's a little bit different than very basic financial skills. But I think that would have been more useful to me later, in my school years.
Thank you. John?
Sam, I teach AP microeconomics, and I can assure you there's no life skills going on there. Oh, we're just lost in theory. But no, I'm just kidding. I think I couldn't make the last community engagement meeting at another obligation, but I think these look really good. And again, I agree with the age appropriate this point that Ben and some others made. In our ends policy says all students in the Taconic and Green Regional School District, I brought this up before, so kind of a two-part point here. Are we saying all K through 8 students in Taconic Regional School District, or all students? And those are it's two very different things. And because if it's all students, it raises we really open up another can of worms, and maybe it's a good thing, but it's another question, to what extent are we as a board accountable and responsible for the education of the schools that our taxpayers send to? And so if we're, I think if we are just making policy that shapes curricula for just our K through 8 students, then we say that, right? And does that preclude pre-K? I don't know. But I think it's important to. It might seem like a detail that we don't need to get into, but at the same time, I think it's a distinction and maybe an important discussion down the road. To what extent are we responsible and accountable for our 9 through 12 students as a board?
I think you've raised an excellent question. I wonder whether the board would mind if we put on the next agenda a possible revision to the 1 point we just passed to define all students. Anybody object to that? Okay, and go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, John, I mean, that's definitely one of the things I had a concern about, because I have to say, years ago, I mean, I taught junior achievement, and part of junior achievement was teaching in 7th and 8th grade about checkbooks. And so if this was like 20 years ago that I did this, I think that the way in which children are educated and kind of expected to begin having life skill knowledge, even if they don't achieve all of that, but just begin getting exposure. I think that there's an expectation that they get exposed much younger these days. I mean, I was teaching it 20, 30 years ago to 7th and 8th graders coming into the schools. And on top of that, we have emancipated youth. You know, I guess I really am concerned about how knowing what is the audience, what is the the students that we teach and what we're responsible for, because I think it really could envelop that there's a lot more need for life skills training than what we might be thinking about.
Well, if we put the question of who is all students on the next agenda, we could certainly be discussing that then. Melanie or David, do you have anything to speak to about this motion other than who all students is? Melanie, go ahead.
I just want to mention, or just kind of address the fact that the academic achievement, the 1.2, that is, even in my mind, a little bit beyond what the rest of the ENDS policy looks like, right? These are goals set forth by the state of Vermont, which I think almost have to be here, right? This is a prescribed thing that has standards that we are expected to live up to. As a board, I don't think we would normally dive down to this level necessarily. I feel like we're charged with the higher level thinking, which is higher level goals, which is the dispositions for lifelong learners and defining that, and the social, emotional, personal learning. I think we recognize that those are things that are, if our kids are well educated, they will achieve these things, right? So I very much hear what you're saying, Jane and Jim. But again, I still fall back on, I don't think it's in our purview to make sure that Randy is teaching how to balance a checkbook. I think it's in our purview to say that we want our students to be self-sufficient and self-directed and have learner agency. But to dive down to that level, I'm not totally sure that fits within. In my mind, it doesn't quite fit where we're supposed to be going with this. But how we reconcile that and bring that to the public, I'm not sure, because they will still have that same question.
At the risk of repeating too much of what Melanie said, I agree. I think, I believe that the policies as written are general enough to allow us to fulfill our objectives for all of our kids. And if we do postpone the discussion for what we're responsible for, then the policies we're doing now still cover that. And I do want to say what we pay for, we are responsible for. So I think we're responsible for pre-K through 12. Pretty simple.
Again, I'd like to put that on the next agenda, and that's actually not part of the motion because the motion is only for 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. I don't see any other hands raised regarding the motion, so I'll call for a vote. All those in favor of approving, remember this is the stage before adoption, approving 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, could you please raise your hand? And anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Not seeing any. That appears to have passed unanimously then. And we have, next item here under number 6 is the equity policy and procedure discussion. Dick.
This comes out of a discussion of the policy committee, because one of the things we did at the retreat was we actually were asked to review the Southern Vermont equity policy, and we found much of it somewhat procedural. We, on the other hand, feel very strongly that this business of equity, whether it should be a policy, where it should be included, should it be a part of the ends, should it be a separate policy, is an important and very important board level discussion. And so we recommended, as the policy minutes suggest, that a new committee specifically containing people who really want to look and focus on this equity policy and what it needs to be, and make a proposal with respect to what the wording of the policy would be and where it should be included, is something that the board should, under policy governance, adopt and vote to establish such a committee. I think that summarizes it, Mel.
Okay. Anybody want to speak to this? Melanie?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think another part of the discussion was that we haven't really discussed this as a full board at all, into the depths of where we even can get in that discussion of, do we want this as a policy or procedure, or do we want to put together a committee? You know, fleshing out what this means to us is you know, kind of the first step.
Anybody else want to speak to this? Yes, Deb.
So Mel, are you saying that we need a board discussion before we go to a committee discussion? Probably. I mean, this is an issue for all of us. So it's a future agenda item then, right?
I thought it, I
Melanie, go
kind
ahead.
of thought,
Yes.
Melanie, did you say everything you wanted to?
I was just going to say, I think that's what this is the discussion as to what this is.
All right.
And Randy would like to say something.
I was just gonna confirm that the reason it's on here is so that you as a board can have a discussion about whether you want to proceed with it as a procedure, which would mean it falls in my lap, or whether you feel like there should be a policy about it. And the discussion in the meeting was that we've kind of skirted around this meeting after meeting after meeting without you as a board really talking about this. And so we put it on here so that you would have the opportunity to be able to do that.
Mhm.
And although it's on the agenda as discussion, I don't think a motion would be out of order here. If it weren't on the agenda at all, then I have a problem that I've explained in my chair's report, but it is on the agenda.
Mhm. So,
So Jane, Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I think it is something that definitely needs to be discussed by the board. I brought this up as an agenda item like 5 months ago. And, you know, I was told history that, you know, I think Ben and other people, the community engagement, were handling it. And I understand there's a lot of reiterations, but I definitely think that this is something that requires a larger discussion.
mhm. I would say.
Well, might it be appropriate at this point for someone to make a motion that we do want to have an equity policy in the policy governance policies, and then we can see which way the vote goes on that?
Right.
Dick?
I would say that the board should have a policy in addition to the definition on equity, and that a committee be established to determine both the language, extent, and the difference between procedures and what the policy would be.
Okay, that was,
No, never.
let me just ask you to restate that, because I don't think we got it all down the first time.
Essentially, it is the board, we're voting as a board that such an equity policy should exist, and that in order to help frame it, that a separate equity committee be established to frame language, number one. Number two, to determine the difference between equity procedures and equity policy. And number 3, where it should be in our policy manual.
Did you get that okay?
I'll let you, it'll be a surprise for the minutes, Dick, or Herb.
What did you say?
She's going to listen to the recording.
Okay, all right. All right, motion by Dick. Is there a second? Seconded by Ben. Okay. Is there discussion? Melanie?
Yeah, I would love to get feedback in here, you know, where people lie. I know this has been on the agenda a couple times, so I'm at this point, I assume it's been read a couple times. I'm reading this so much more like a procedure rather than a policy. And so I'm curious if that's just me. And also, I'm curious if that's the case, where in policy governance, I guess I have a question in that, what is more, where are we going to hold the accountability with equity? Do we want to hold it within ourselves as the board, or do we want to bind Rein in the district to it through procedure? And I think those are kind of my overarching questions.
Melanie, when you referred to this, are you talking about the School Boards Association model policy?
Yes, I am. Thank you for that
Okay,
question.
I don't understand the motion as saying that we would necessarily be adopting that. Was that your intent, Dick?
No.
No, it wasn't his intent.
It was to determine what the language would be, but we have to first start with the idea that the board endorses that there should be a policy.
Right.
So,
And then following that, determining the language of what the policy would be, following a part of that discussion is to differentiate, much like the policy on sexual abuse, where there are a whole series of procedures which carry the weight of policies, but they're procedures. And it's very different. And so we have a definition on equity. It is an overarching kind of idea. It's part of our norms. It's part of a lot of what we do. But I'm proposing that we formally have an equity policy and that we have a committee to frame the language that would be appropriate for policy governance as it differs from procedures.
Right. And the way I read things, if when this comes up next month, if we vote in favor of of the motion, then the committee would be set up at the next meeting. Is that your intent, Dick? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because people should volunteer for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, just to emphasize my answer to Melanie's point, we're not talking about adopting what's on packet page 13. We're talking about a broader question.
Yeah.
Deb and then Jim.
Yeah, I agree with Mel. I think if we're going to stick to policy governance, then our governance, that talks about how we govern, not implementing day-to-day actions. So in our global ends and 1.0, we say that kids should be equity-minded. We highlight equity literacy as one of our global ends, which is really important. And then under executive limitations, which is where this probably would land, we have a policy currently that says the superintendent will not allow barriers to exist that prevent students from achieving their potential. That, maybe with a little bit of wording would be the limit that we could insert an equity policy into policy governance. We have to allow the superintendent to implement it. We can't prescribe all the steps that she would take. And in other school districts that don't have policy governance, they adopt those policies, and that's their list of policies. In our form of governance, we have policies that direct the superintendent to implement these things, but we call them procedures. That doesn't mean they have any less weight And they're all, if you, on our website, the policies and the procedures are on the same page. You know, they have the same authority. So to not call the VSBA policy a policy does not diminish its impact or its value. We just as a board say we want our superintendent to pay attention to that, to live up to those standards, and then we let her implement it.
To move the discussion along, I just want to remind you that the only thing you're really voting on tonight is whether to have a policy,
Okay.
not what the policy is going to say. Jim?
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to, just a couple of items. One is, I'm not sure where a definition fits into our overall structure of policy governance and all. So, we have this definition, but, I don't know. I don't know where that fits in or whether it, should actually be brought into policy. The second thing is, I agree completely that, the nature of our policies, they actually, things intertwine in our policies, kind of just like Deb was saying, it shows up in a lot of different places, which is good. But just to comment on the VSBA policy, I totally agree that the implementation is getting a little too procedural, but the first part's a policy and definition. Since Mel asked for some feedback, I think those are actually reasonably good from the perspective of what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay. Considering the limited scope of the motion and the fact that we have a lot of things to cover between now and 8:30, could you please try to keep the remaining comments as brief as possible, and please don't repeat what somebody else said. Melanie?
I just wanted to say that I think that this discussion before that meeting is actually really important, so that if we do have that committee, they have some sense of how the entire board feels, and don't go into it blindly. And I just want to encourage, thank you, Jim, for helping share that perspective about the procedure. And that's information that is really necessary from everybody before any committee can go anywhere with it.
David?
So if I agree with Melanie and Deb, does that mean I vote against this motion?
I wouldn't say so.
It sounds
because
like we
again,
should vote
the
against it. And
Dick, do you want to speak to that, or shall I?
I believe that if you vote in favor of the motion, then what we're committing to is a policy and a committee to establish that policy. That's what the motion essentially boils down to. And the discussion is important, and I'm glad we've had it. But I would recommend, David, that if you're in favor of having a policy on equity, that you vote yes.
And I would just put my oar in to say that right now, since we have a definition of equity, but it doesn't tie to any policy, the definition is kind of an orphan. David?
I was just going to say, I think the definition can be linked. I thought initially we were just saying this thing that we've got from the VSBA is mostly a procedure. If we just adopt the definition that they call a policy, and then we ask Randy to implement as best she can, I thought that covered it. Kept it simple.
That's not what the motion is about, though.
That's why I want to vote against the motion.
No. Yeah, well, let me suggest what the effect of voting against the motion would be, which would be that we would have no policy that specifically addressed equity.
But
if you vote against, you're saying we don't need an equity policy anywhere. Ben and then Deb, and please, folks, remember we do have a goal of trying to wind up at 8:30, and that's only an hour and 10 minutes away.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think there are 2 points. I mean, David, I think when I read this, I read through the policy of this, and I think just the one line The district will incorporate principles of equity within all policies, programs, operations, practices, and resource allocations. Having a policy somewhere that says that allows us then to use the equity definition and apply it to all other policies. And what we don't have is that headline piece. So I would like to I'd support us to at least have the conversation, figure out what a small policy language like that could do so that we can incorporate it in. And I also think it's really important that this be a place that we can really engage the community in conversation. This has been a huge hot button topic in a lot of communities around the state. And I think we shouldn't expect that it will blow up into something radical in our community because that hasn't surfaced as being something there. But I think it is important that this be part of that in some way. So that's not part of the motion, but I think any discussion that we engage in, any policy that we implement is an opportunity for public community engagement.
John.
Yeah, I agree with the last part, Ben, about, it's important to educate our community. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about equity and equating it to equality. And it's like turned into a trope, in some places throughout the country. And I'm concerned that will happen here, or maybe it's happening here to some extent. And that people are thinking like, oh, my student, my kid has higher achieving, equity means they're not going to get the same, what they need. So I'm worried that maybe that's already started to happen in a silent way. And I think that our community needs some education about what equity actually is.
Seeing no more hands up, I'm going to call for a vote. All those in favor of the motion, does anybody need to have the motion restated, first of all? Don't see that. All right, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. That appears to have passed unanimously. I would say it has passed unanimously. Thank you very much. Let's move right now into item 7 on the agenda, which is the executive limitations policy. First item there would be, I need a motion to approve the interpretation of 2.2.
I move to approve the interpretation of 2.2, treatment of staff.
Is there a second?
We already.
The approval is the first step, adoption is the second step.
Okay.
Oh, that's right. This is simply this is an interpretation, so it just needs an approval. That's right. Is there a second? Seconded by Melanie. Okay. I have a question, Randy. It's written here, I recommend the board remove volunteers from this policy. And my question is, how would volunteers be handled? Is there some other thing that we can use to monitor appropriate treatment of volunteers?
Potentially. There are already practices sort of in place around volunteers related to what we do as far as screening and background checks and their role within schools. If we wanted something separate that kind of delineated in writing what that is, that would be something that's outside the scope of what I think is intended in this, and certainly something that would not be a problem at all to tighten up if we needed something. I just didn't feel like, as I was working on this, that including volunteers was appropriate. Because it's a different process when you have a paid employee, as far as how we are operating as an organization. And commingling them didn't make sense when I was trying to work on this.
Dick, I think, has a
I need to
point of order.
restate the motion so that it agrees with your recommendation. And that is to eliminate the word "and volunteer" from the policy itself, and then we approve the treatment of staff in its interpretation and evidence. And Mel, you seconded it, so you have to kind of approve of that change.
Well, and I'm going to be a stickler here because the agenda says approve interpretation of 2.2. I think we need a 2/3 vote to change this to actual a change in the policy itself.
Only if it's substantive. It is.
Well, I would say this is substantive.
Okay, but
So,
I move to suspend the Robert's Rules of Order in order to make a change in the policy. It requires a second and a 2/3 vote.
Right. Okay, is there a second? Seconded by David, okay. Any discussion about whether we are going to suspend the rules just so that we can make that change in the policy? Don't see any. All those in favor, please raise your hand. That's clearly 2/3. Okay.
Then I move that the policy be restated to say, with respect to the treatment of paid staff, the superintendent shall not, and then it concludes as if the rest of it is written.
Great. Okay, is there a second to that motion? Jim. Okay, Jim has seconded it. Any discussion about removing, this would be the approval stage of a change in the policy, not the adoption stage. Any discussion about whether to approve that change in the policy? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand.
And then I move
That passes.
to approve the interpretation of 2.2, treatment of staff.
Okay, yeah, that needs a second, seconded by Jim. Any discussion? I have one question. Is the compliance will be demonstrated when part actually necessary? It just seems to restate
yeah.
the evidence part.
So that's a great question. I'm trying to be consistent in how I organize these, but I had exactly the same, I felt exactly the same way. This was surprisingly complicated to work on for as simple as it is, because it was so easy to overthink it. I don't think it's necessary, other than the fact that yes, it's redundant, but it's consistent with the other interpretations.
Yeah. But I would be in favor of eliminating words whenever we can. Dick, would you agree to?
I would be happy to agree to eliminate the compliance section.
Okay, it's not okay with you, Jim? I believe you were the second. Yes, it is okay with him. Any other discussion? Seeing none. Oops, I'm sorry, Deb.
He's voting in favor.
Oh, you're just voting. Okay. All right. All those in favor of the motion, which is to approve the interpretation with the elimination of the compliance will be demonstrated paragraph, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. That passes, I believe, unanimously. Thank you. And now we come to the monthly update, which begins on packet page 15. Randy, anything you want to particularly call our attention to, or anything happened just recently?
It's a good question. There's always lots happening recently, as as you've seen over and over again. We've talked about this in the past, but sort of to update, because I did not draw attention to it under staffing. I did talk about bus drivers. Continues to be a significant concern. Both Derek and Greg are driving routes right now. We do not have any substitute capacity right now, and it's important to recognize that. I was just communicating this afternoon with principals about sending emails out to families, letting them know that we may find ourselves in a position in which we can't operate a bus. We were talking about creative problem solving around this, and, could we sort of take some of maybe our smaller routes and talk to parents and have a backup plan. The problem is that many of those folks don't have CDL licenses, so they're going to be exploring it, but it's not as simple as I would like to make it. And Greg and Derek are working very hard at figuring out solutions. But like I said, you need to know that the two of them are driving every single day routes. Betcha doesn't have enough drivers, so they're not fulfilling their contracts. So we're absorbing driving Betcha routes. And as you know, we have kids all over the place. It's kind of a continuous topic. So on top of the challenges we're having with after school programming, challenges with getting paras, the bus situation is a big one as well. And I think just operationally, you should be aware of that.
That's pretty much of a problem in a lot of parts of the state, isn't it?
It is not unique to us in any way you look at it. It's not unique to us. So, yeah, I mean, you see the information in here. I'm happy to discuss anything with you. As I mentioned earlier, but probably from my perspective, the new information for you is related to how I intend on moving forward with collecting information to present to you about the potential need for exploring the possibility of a middle school. I think that it's my responsibility to determine whether or not there actually is an identified educational need or operational need from current and past students, families, middle school staff, elementary school staff, get information and then present that to you. And my time frame is to have stakeholder input as an initial starting point and a recommendation to you prior to budget season in case there are any steps that I want to recommend to you that have a budgetary impact as far as continuing with moving forward with that. I have my own personal perspective on this, but I don't think that that's my job. My job is to try to collect as much information as I can and determine whether there is a need identified by others in addition to me, and then go from there.
Okay, questions or comments? Jim is first.
Yeah, Randy, on sections, the VSBA came out with some, they went to council with, along with Visbit and to address that issue, and they came up with a slightly different answer. In my book, this is, in your hands, you inform us. I just wanted to make sure you were factoring in, because they were sort of suggesting a little less than you're talking about doing.
I know.
Okay.
John.
I've read it and consulted with our legal counsel about what came out in that recommendation. And I think that the approach we're taking right now is the right one. Should something change in the future, I will be changing the procedure.
John.
Does Randy, does the influx of some federal money from the pandemic give us any wiggle room to increase wages for staff positions where we're experiencing shortages?
We have a staff agreement that is going to be we're up for renewal for the staff agreement, but because we have an agreement, we have to work within the information in there. So with that will happen this year, and I expect it to increase. But aside from positions that are not under the agreement, we do have some that are not under the agreement, but increasing rates of pay for only that specific population creates additional issues for us that I don't feel comfortable with. So we've got to get through this year right now, but I'll be very frank with you. My recommendation to the negotiation committee is going to be to increase our base pay for support positions.
And okay, so bus drivers fall under the staff as well. Are they? Is it mandatory that bus drivers fall under that staff agreement? Similar to teachers and non-union teachers and teacher contracts.
So we have some bus drivers that are protected by the agreement and some that are not. That's what creates the problem.
Because some of it's done through a contractor, right?
No, because some of them are BRSU routes and some of them are Taconic and Green routes. And
And
we
you have
did
to
not
offer them the same wages?
What?
You have to offer them the same wages
We
legally?
don't have to, but I create an equity in our system if the folks that we hire for T&G, I don't have any wiggle room with, and the folks I hire for BRSU, I decide I'm gonna offer some other rate to. We're stuck in many ways right now. We've gone over this a whole heck of a lot of times.
Okay.
Thank
Any
It's
other,
the agreements that strap us on that right now.
are there other comments or questions on the superintendent's report? All right, seeing none, I want to thank Randy very much, and let's move to, Susan,
David has his hand up.
you did?
I wondered if
I
there
don't
was
see
a
it.
typo. I just wanted to know if there was a typo in this report on page 2 of Randy's report, in the section on the tuition to secular schools. If you go to page 2, the second paragraph, the last sentence, unless I misunderstand the word secular, it says we are agreeing to pay for the portion of the student's day that is not identified as secular. And I thought secular is non-religious, so I thought it should be the other way around. Or am I not understanding it?
I'm using secular here as religiously based programming.
I think there may be some confusion here between secular and sectarian. I think David is actually right.
Okay, let me look into that. The point is that we're not paying for
Okay.
religious programming educational. So I'll clarify that for all of you, just use that terminology.
Good point,
Okay.
David.
Good.
Thank you.
All right, any other comments on the superintendent's report or questions for the superintendent? Let's move to the next item, which is the ARP ESSER community input. Starts on packet page 18.
Okay, I think I'm gonna have to stop fasting and then read this. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
Do we have any public out there prepared to weigh in on this discussion?
Not that I know of, I don't know.
Is Celeste still here?
Celeste is still here.
Yes. Celeste? I don't think so, because they would be in the meeting, because we're not streaming someplace.
What can I do for you, Randy?
So we just, there was this discussion about whether there was public, but we're not streaming live to YouTube, so there's nobody in another spot other than who's in the meeting and who's in our room, who's in the
Correct.
virtual. Okay. So you are our only public, so you get to join this conversation later on at the end of it if you'd like. Okay.
Okay.
So
Well, actually, he could, since we're looking for public input, he could join it right now, couldn't he?
yes, but I'm going to kind of go over the
Oh,
whole
okay,
thing,
yeah, yeah,
and then at
right.
the end is when we will discuss.
Right,
it.
okay. I thought you meant the end of the meeting.
Nope, I meant sort of the end of this presentation.
Yeah.
So I will go through this. I can't see folks on my screen anymore because of how I have this set up. So, okay. So just somebody let me know. If you feel like you would like to interrupt me midstream, that's fine. But if you feel like you can wait, that's also good. So,
Yeah, and sir, that applies to you too.
so I'm going to talk to you about the BRSU ARP ESSER overview. And ARP stands for the American Rescue Plan Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds. Okay, so I'm going to go over this, and you should get information as I talk through it. So these are federal funds that were set up in order to support schools after the pandemic, which we're still in, I guess. So, and so every single state receives federal funds based on the prior year's Title I funding allocation. Right, so the states get it from the feds that way. And then the state of Vermont keeps up to 10%, I think about 10% of their allocation. And then the balance 90% is allocated to the local educational agencies, school districts, based on the Title I eligibility within their system. And then the state's gonna, so the state will give it to us. And so there's a whole process that we have to use, and that's what we're gonna talk about next. So our allocation is about $3.4 million, and we need to spend all of our funds by September 30th, 2024. There's really specific guidance for how we can use these funds. Folks are, it's really tempting to use it for a lot of things that are not eligible uses. So we will, Sue and I have clear guidance, at least as clear as we could have right now, about how we can use this. And so we are working hard to make sure that what we submit will be approved because it falls under what we're allowed to use the funds for. Okay. So we are going to be requesting input from the community in a variety of ways every 6 months until the fall, September, probably of 2024. I expect we'll kind of end that time frame with our last submission. We are expecting at this point to submit in October, January, and April. And then we'll conduct community engagement sessions in September and March. And the purpose of this, the time when we're collecting information in the community, is for them to give feedback to us about what we're planning on submitting for and ask questions, and also to make suggestions and recommendations for other ways in which we should use these funds. So right now, for our initial submission, these are the investments that we are planning on submitting at this point. So the first is after-school enrichment experiences. So I want our kids to be able to engage in after-school enrichment opportunities at all of our schools. Starting, what we're submitting for at this point is for the second half of this school year. So January to May of 2022. And the investment supports paying staff, materials and supplies, and transportation. I want to make sure that anybody who wants to participate can get home at the end of the whatever the enrichment experience is.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt? Randy, you're looking at slides, yes?
I am. Can you not see it? Oh, because I'm not am I really not screen sharing? Hold on. Sorry.
That's okay.
Karen, I'm realizing. Hold on. Give me a second now. Now I can't even find you. Okay. Here we go. Okay, let's see if this works. Better?
Yes, we're getting there.
Okay. All right, so now what can you see? Yes, you can see where we are?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So a couple of years ago, I guess 3 years ago now, the leadership team here began training with the University of Washington in instructional leadership. So we had somebody come out from the University of Washington and train our principals and central office leaders in instructional leadership. We did not complete that work, and we've talked about how important it is. So so we're including this to complete the training over the 22-23 and 23-24 school years. For this year, and this will change over time, but for our initial investment, we want to provide equity training for teachers and staff, partnering with Outright Vermont during this school year. We've had a lot of teachers and staff who are uncertain, have questions about supporting our students who are members of the LGBTQ plus community, and so we want to support them in their learning and understanding of how to best support our kids. We put in for flexible seating. Prior to the pandemic, we had done a lot of flexible seating, so that kids have different types of seats, styles, sizes, heights, and some of those we're not able to use anymore because they are made of fabric and other materials that are porous, and so we want to be able to change those out in our schools. That might also change over time. The cost might change if we get additional interest in this. So curriculum planning and purchase. as Deb alluded to, you will see that we need to, I feel strongly we need to attend our curriculum. So this year we will be having teams of teachers reviewing our current curriculum and assessing our kind of what we have in place now, reviewing potential new curriculum. All of that's going to take time. And then we are anticipating that there'll be a curricular purchase at the end of that. So we're putting this in to have a placeholder as we move forward. And then there is a recommendation for an outdoor play space at one of our schools in which there can be collaborative opportunities with kids across different grade levels and ages in order to kind of come together creatively, re-engaging and developing social emotional skills. So I'm including that. And then we have some positions over the next couple of years. We did not want to get too heavily into positions because I've made it very clear that we are not intending on continuing these positions once the funding ends. So it's tricky and it can be challenging if you add positions to then take them away. So we don't have a lot in here. An MTSS coordinator we have for this year and next year in order to develop our tiered system of supports aligned with Act 173. So
Randy, what's an MTSS?
Multi-tiered system of support. So the multi-tiered system of support for academic systems and for social emotional systems so that our students have a robust core instruction program in both social emotional and academics, and then we have tiered system of supports to meet students who need or require additional more specialized or more targeted academic programming. We had included student engagement specialist and academic and a student engagement and what is the academic intervention means?
We have the literacy and the other, I think we're talking about that shared position with the library at Courier.
Yes.
Intervention piece.
Yeah, so we've got some intervention. Yes, we've got some intervention at Courier. We've got some literacy in there, student engagement. All of that is post-pandemic to support students re-entering our system and giving some additional services and programming to them. We added a social worker for a couple of years with the same purpose, make sure we're connecting with students and families as we return. We have an additional nurse at Sunderland in order to address the medical and health needs there and to make sure we've got somebody on site at each of our schools. We have an additional instructional coach in for the middle school. An IT tech position.
Randy, what's the function of instructional coach?
So it's somebody to focus on improving instructional practices for.
So working with the teachers or with the
yes,
parents, okay.
It's a coach for the teachers. So this particular person, we realized we have not attended closely to our middle school in recent years, and so it was a lot of feedback we received last year about us making sure that we're attending to them as a unit and the unique developmental needs, both academically and social emotionally for our middle school students. This is an IT tech position with all of the work that we've done with technology. We have many more devices and a lot more upkeep right now, and we want to provide some additional support to help kind of get above and ahead of some of the magnitude of the work. This first para position is a specific one related to, frankly, meal delivery, and where we are right now with the cafeteria and kids eating in classrooms still in most places, we needed literally an extra set of hands to pick up, drop off, deal with composting so that our kids could be not needing to leave their space and be picking up and delivering food and losing instructional time. Then I put in here paras, just as a broad category with a amount of money, just $250,000. We have had a significant increase of English language learner students this year, unexpectedly, and there are a lot of non-English speakers in our schools right now, and I want to make sure that we are supporting them as much as we can. As you know, we're struggling to get people, but I would like to be able to, use money here to support some additional positions for our kids.
Randy, what is SEL?
Social emotional learning needs. We're still wrapping our head around our new students who are here. We've got a lot of kids with more complex needs moving in, and we've got English language learners and kids who have social emotional support. So let's put them in, let's see what we can do. And the hope and expectations, we don't need to continue those positions. And then, again, we needed some additional food service support right now with the changes in how we're operating food service. So, the total estimated investments at this point is just under $2 million. And so we still have about $1.5 million left for future investments. Some things that we know we want to offer training that are not included here are Orton Gillingham based training for classroom teachers and special educators and reading interventionists. This is a really specialized reading program and reading instruction for kids in grades K to 3. We're also expecting many more school-specific requests coming through. Frankly, principals didn't really have a handle at the beginning of the year of exactly what their needs are going to be, especially with kind of the start that we've had. So I'm expecting that for our January submission that we have more requests from schools. I expect that to come through. So that's sort of a big picture overview. And I am certainly interested in hearing questions, thoughts, and hearing from board members and the public about, hey, have you thought about this? Are there is this a potential use? Or I'm wondering where you are, any recommendations you have. I will say that just before we open that up for you, we've got on our website, we've got this PowerPoint, and we've got a form for people to be providing input to us. We've got the information out on social media, which as of, I think this morning, we had about 1,500 views of the presentation. And so I haven't looked at the responses, but we're doing what we can to get the information out there and to solicit input from community members. Okay?
Randy, have we done that through Front Porch Forums at all?
I did not ask Bob. We were sort of in a place, I'll be totally honest with you, on Tuesday afternoon, after I had everything rolled out ready to go for schools on Thursday, Tuesday late afternoon, I got an email from the AOA. Sue said, did you see the email? I said no, and this was literally Tuesday night with all of the guidance that we needed to follow around this process. So we did not know it was coming, and it all came on Tuesday night. So I then had to spend time looking at that on Wednesday and Thursday, figuring out how does what we were planning dovetail with what the requirements are from the state and the feds, and what are we required to do and what can we do how we are. That sort of derailed my process a little bit. So I haven't had the conversation with Bob about all of the places in which he operates on social media. We'll fine tune that in the next couple of days, but it's on my list. Front Porch Forum. I know we have it linked to our websites. I believe it's on Northshire, but I'll check all of those details. So it almost came to a halt, and then I said it's not coming to a halt. We're going to continue because we want to get this submitted. So
thank you.
What else? Look at how quiet you are. It must be like 2.5 hours.
I would like to say that at our board retreat, we passed a motion that asked our legislators to be more, and state administrators to be a little more timely in terms of getting us information so that we could appropriately respond to it. And this is just yet another example of last second planning. I mean, after our little agenda planning meeting, you had to go the next day for a 3.5 hour meeting on COVID new rules. And that's a little late in the game to reinvent and publicize what the rules are going to be. Thank goodness the board was appropriate by saying, we will follow the guidelines and we'll do our best. And the superintendent, we absolutely support her desire to keep staff and students safe. And if we hadn't done that, we might be in even bigger trouble.
You're in no trouble right now with on the
Hey. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I have a question. So those are just the expenses that you showed are just to utilize the one-time money coming in from the federal
Correct.
government. So after that ends, all those programs go away and the people go away?
The positions are going away. Yeah. So we are trying to be very careful about hiring them, letting them know that, hey, this is how we're hiring you. It's for this amount of time, for this purpose, and we're really transparent about that. And they were hired understanding that.
Another question on, in terms of the expenses, the after-school program.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seemed like a modest number.
Mm-hmm. So that's just for this spring. What we will likely do is once we figure out, okay, what's the capacity of our staff? How are we with COVID? Where we can adjust it as we need to. We will also be putting something in for next year that will be, I hope, for the entire year and be even more robust. It's a little bit conservative with everything uncertain right now, but we can adjust it. We can adjust both the amount and what we put in there once it's approved.
And the teacher training from the University of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, about BBM.
So they have, the University of Washington has a Center for Educational Leadership. It's a very, very, very well-known entity that this is all they do, is focus on instructional leadership for system leaders. There's nobody locally that does that. So what they do is they work with districts across the country. And their framework that they use, it's a model that's really well developed and effective. So that's how you went with them.
You found it beneficial.
They were very good. Mm-hmm. They were very good. And now there's so much we can do remotely. And so now that we've started, we're hoping that cost is high as well, because maybe they don't need to come out as many. They came out, I think, 5 times the first year. Yeah, those are good questions.
Enviable position. You've got another $1.5 million.
Yeah, and I'm excited. I'm really open, to ideas and feedback about, what can we build and do, to your point, that is sort of sustainable. I don't want to buy a lot of positions. I'd rather invest in long-term efforts that will carry us into the future and have longer term impact.
Can you use it for plant equipment?
For plant?
Plant and equipment, buildings.
Yes. So we are working. One of the requirements that came in on Tuesday night was around really having a website that's all of our information related to ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and then this third pot of money for our ESSER, for it all to be very, very publicly available. So we are constructing a website right now, and we have a lot of construction involved in our ESSER 2 submission. So That is all going to be available online. We'll put it all there, but we funded a lot of upgrades, heating, a lot of work to all of our heating units. Everything was fully operational, but we took the opportunity to say, okay, what are things that we anticipate might need significant repair in the next 5 to 10 years? Let's go ahead and fund those now through this funding source so you don't have to pay for it locally. So we've got heating, we've got ventilation, you've probably got the list right in front of you.
Windows, doors, security, carpeting. There's a lot of projects that anywhere between $50,000 and a couple $100,000 type projects in all of our schools, and that's with the ESSER 2 money.
Yeah, so you can, and I'm happy before you leave, I can get your email address and make sure to send you the link if you're interested. So it's all going to be captured there.
Can you update your IT systems with that money too?
So I just got, 2 days ago, I got an email from our director of ed technology with their wish list. And I said, okay, we need a little more information here. There wasn't a lot of details, but we are gonna be, there are definitely parts that I think we can fund through this. So they're gonna be updating that with more details, and then we'll be including that in January submission. I just didn't even include it here. I haven't had a chance to update this, but yeah, that's a big part that you're looking at long term. Sure.
And if you think of something else after I've let a couple board members speak, feel free to put your order in again too, since you're the entire public. Okay, Ben.
Thanks. Just quickly, I was thinking about the new end policies that we just set, and I was thinking specifically about 1.3 social, emotional, and personal learning, and that there's some money that's targeted towards social emotional literacy and coaches along with and support along with that, and there's a little bit around equity literacy, but and then ecological literacy being the third. And just thinking that, you know, those would be great areas for professional development funds to go to training staff in those areas to support them in this transition time. So I don't know how that fits, but there are some really good providers within Vermont that specialize in those areas that might be interesting to look into. So just as a 2 cents. And yeah. I did ask my family too for input, and I just got the quick feedback from kids and partner on quality after school programs and outdoor classrooms and training related to as other input.
So the PD piece is one, everyone has been waiting for the ends policy to get to a place in which it could be shared. And professional development across the board, you'll see there's not a lot of it in here. Schools right now are working on their PD plans, and at a system level, you're talking about exactly the work that we're going to be thinking about over the next 4 to 6 months. So you should expect to see that training either in January or for sure for the April submission as we look to the next couple of years.
John.
Yeah, I love the idea of more. I think it's a good list so far. I love the idea of more outdoor education as a parent and teacher. Clarifying question though. So it says the estimated investments are so far 1.9 million, and you have for future investment remainder of 1.4 million. Now, were these funds received in a lump, or will they be received in a lump sum? And you know, after that, let's say the first round of investments, where does that, assuming that they are received in lump sums, does the money sit in the bank account? Where
it's not received in a lump sum. I'm not sure why.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Okay. Okay. Do you want? So I was just gonna. Yeah, they can hear you through hers. So I was gonna say that it's not received in a lump sum. So Sue, I'll let Sue talk about the process, but it's through an application and well,
that's what it is. It's a reimbursement request, John. So as we spend money, we request reimbursement. We provide the supporting documentation on the actual.
I'm sorry, Sue. I'm having trouble. You're going in and out. Maybe other people are having the same problem too. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
So it's a reimbursement system. So as we spend money, we provide the state supporting documentation of our expenditures, and they'll approve the reimbursement that way, and then they send us the money. So the turnaround time is fairly quickly. It goes fairly quickly, but we don't get anything in advance if we have to spend the money first.
Well, and even before that, we need to submit in the system the request. The request has to be approved, then we can spend the money, then we get the reimbursement. So if we spend anything prior to it being approved, it's not going to be eligible. So there's even more before that.
Yeah, there's an application process to have the grant approved prior to us even being allowed to spend it.
Okay.
That's why it's so critical that I start this process now, because for us to jump through all of the hoops in order to have the money and the time that we want to it, and that we needed to start this process now.
Okay. The reason I asked that is just wondering, if is there anything we could do to get any small return on it? Money's sitting around, but we don't have that.
We wish.
No,
Just in case we're not losing it, any value to inflation or anything. But
Okay, let's have Melanie next then.
right.
I was just going to ask Randy, I know that the summer program was hugely successful and we've been offering free lunches, and I think that's a state. I just want to clarify that that's separate, or how does that fit into the ESSER funds? Both of those items.
Okay, so summer, we funded not with ARP ESSER, but with other ESSER funds last summer. To be totally honest, I know it was very, very well received and it was great for our kids. It took a giant, giant toll on our system, and I can't even begin to think about that for next summer right now. People would not be able to respond sort of with a clear mind on it. No cost for universal school meals this year. So summer is already paid through other ESSER funds and no cost for universal meals.
There's no charge
Thank you.
to families,
No charge to families,
but there will be costs to locally.
so talk more about that.
So,
Okay, can everybody hear what he was
so
saying?
the reimbursement rate for the summer nutrition program, which we'll be operating under again this year, is higher. So we will get reimbursement from the feds for our program, but that is still not enough to cover all of our costs of our program. What you guys are used to seeing is supporting the food service program locally. There's a chunk of money that we pay for, taxpayers cover. We can never cover the full cost of our program. And I can't say for sure how much we would have to pay for next year, whether or not we would break even. Well, this year, excuse me, whether or not we'd break even, whether or not we would make money, or whether or not we would have to cover some costs locally. I think that it makes sense for us to anticipate having to cover some costs locally.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to ask 100% of the public if you have any suggestions or any other comments. Okay. Anybody on the board have any suggestions or comments? And remember to publicize the fact this is on the website, and we're looking for input here. All right. It's now 8:10, and I think we are not going to be able to finish at 8:30 if we go through the rest of the agenda. On the other hand, we have some items that have been bumped along a couple of times already. I'm wondering if you folks would be willing to go to at least 8:45 tonight. I know this is asking a lot because we began at 6, but we do have a pretty long list of things to cover here. Anybody who isn't willing to go that long, could you make an anguished face or something? Okay, I don't see any really anguished faces. I can't tell what Dick's looks like because he's got his mask on. But
Well, if you make us laugh first, how are you going to make an anguished face?
this is true. Okay,
Let's go.
Let's go.
The policy committee went through in light of the decision to allow the policy committee to revise some of the policies and also create interpretation and add some convenient stuff. And so each one of these that's in your board packet has stuff that's been cut out, stuff that's been added, and that's generally in yellow. And we followed the lengthy memo from our august chair that was in great detail with respect to large numbers of linguistic, grammatical, and other suggested changes. We've incorporated every single one of those. So our chair probably won't have any objections. And if he does, he failed to say them up front. So I think we can probably get through this in the approval phase by just going 4.0, 4.1, and I would move each of them for approval and in its turn, separately, one by one, and then we can have a discussion if someone would second it.
Okay, who would like to second the motion to approve 4.0? I see
You got
David, okay.
You got all sorts
A number of people, okay. All right, so 4.0 is in front of you. Any discussion? And I don't see any hands. All those in favor? Oops, John, sorry.
Just a clarification with approval versus adoption. If we approve it and then can we still make minor changes in between approval and adoption, or does it get bumped back to approval? Okay, just want to make sure. All right, thank you.
That's right. Well, 4.0 actually is only an approval because it doesn't change the policy.
No.
Right, it says, this is an interpretation.
Right. Right. When we hit 4.1, then it'll be different. But 4.0 is just approval because the only thing we're adding is interpretation and evidence. We're not changing the policy. Deb.
Deb, you're muted.
We, as in the previous policies, we aren't monitoring these policies. We're just setting up a procedure for doing the monitoring next year. What is the evidence we would look for next year? So if you see evidence that we haven't included, that would be helpful.
Right. And I think what it says on packet page 20, which is approved monitoring interpretation, is actually more correct than what the top of packet page 21 says, which is monitoring report. Is that right?
Yes.
It's not an actual report.
Right.
Deb, did you want to say something else? No. Any other discussion on approving 4.0 again, which does not change the policy? All it does is add interpretation and evidence. I don't see any. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Any opposed, please raise your hand.
4.1.
Okay, that passes unanimously then.
4.1, the policy was actually approved, the change of adding community engagement to the policy. And so actually it's not an approval of our change in the policy. We already approved the policy change. So it's now just interpretation all the way through. And I would suggest the whole thing, unless somebody wants to break it down because somebody's got some objections.
So I'll take that as a motion to approve 4.1. And if I understand correctly, Dick, the change that you see about community engagement is something we already adopted. Is that right?
Yes, it is correct.
Yeah. So the only thing in front of you is whether you want to approve the interpretation and evidence pieces that you see on packet pages 23 through 25. And there's a motion by Dick to do that. Is there a second? No. Seconded by Melanie. Any discussion? Okay, Jim?
Yeah, just in 4.1.4 interpretation, wondering if you intentionally dropped the vice chair position?
We did because we have not defined an executive committee, and by the state law, both the clerk and the chair are specifically empowered to do some of this function. And the reason the clerk was included was if the offender happens to be the chair, then there's nobody to report to. If you've got some degree of complaint, anybody can be invited by the chair to sit on agenda formation or any other situation. So because we haven't defined executive committee anywhere, we fell back on the state law.
Thank you. Melanie?
I wanted to add that we had at one point where I brought up the retreat about the idea of, you know, being able to reach out if we thought that there was an offendee on the board, etc. And after doing kind of some rudimentary research, I fell on that, you know, there is a whistleblower policy that exists within policy governments. It's also a federal mandate. And since that already is a policy, and I kind of didn't click with me at the time that we figured that was sufficient, and we didn't write anything specifically into policy about that, knowing that that exists.
Okay. Seeing no other hands, I will then call for a vote on approving 4.1. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Anybody abstaining? Raise your hand. It appears to pass unanimously. Dick, do you have a motion on 4.2?
The board approved the monitoring interpretation of 4.2. Some of the things that have been written in are a reorder of some of the extant policies. The words have not changed. We just put them in a more appropriate order.
And I wouldn't think that would be a substantive change, so we
No.
at this point, we can actually, if we've already approved it, this would be an adoption item, wouldn't it?
No. The issue is we need to approve the interpretation. And
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. So what we're doing is recognizing that some of the words of the policy have been rearranged, but it's still the same words, just in a different place. And that leaves
grammatically more correct.
Right, grammatically more correct. That just leaves adoption. That leaves approval of the evidence and interpretation sections. And that's a motion by Dick. Is there a second? Deb is seconded, I think. Okay. Discussion. And Deb.
Deb, you muted.
We rearranged the very last part of this policy to make it clear that some of our responsibilities are mandated by Vermont law, and they're not strictly policy governance duties, but that we're required to do them anyway.
Thank you. Any other discussion of the motion? Seeing none, then, all those in favor, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand.
And I would make
That passes.
I would make two other observations. Jane is going to do the rough draft for the policy committee for 4.3. I'm going to take a look at 4.4. October looks to be a very busy meeting, so we may take advantage of the fact that we have one extra week in our policies to actually not do this whole thing next month unless there's time, and the same process would kind of go forward. So if everyone would please take a look at 4.3 and 4.4 and send Jane 4.3 suggestions and me 4.4, that would be appreciated. And lastly, again, Mel will be badly missed because she keeps us on a straight and narrow. But we really do need a replacement.
And Celeste, can you please make sure that what Dick just said about who to contact regarding which one appears in the minutes, just as a reminder?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, great. Okay, next item would be the VSBA Exceptional School Board Leadership Award nomination. Randy?
I would like to nominate the Taconic and Green Board for this award. You've been nominated in the past and received, I don't know, something that was awesome but not quite a winner. So I'd like to nominate you again and to be able to consult with chair, vice chair, and clerk in the application process.
Okay.
I'm making you aware of it. I guess I don't know that I'm really asking for your input, but I get if you have something I should know about not doing it, I'll listen. But I would like to nominate you.
Okay.
Any concerns, please let me know.
Right, so this is the point which you open the closet and see if there's any skeletons.
You are an exceptionally awesome board, and it is without hesitation that I would like to do this.
Okay.
So,
Melanie?
As long as you don't mention Sue Wilborn so she doesn't get poached at the state level, we're good. We need to keep her in the, you know, on the down low.
Okay, any other discussion? All right, this doesn't call for action because the superintendent, or anybody for that matter, I think, can make a nomination, and we'll just go ahead and follow her recommendation about who works it up then. All right, and the next item under that would be the board chair's report, and all I would like to say there is that I think on a future agenda, I would like the board to handle some of the suggestions that I made there, but we don't need to discuss it tonight unless somebody has something burning. It looks like nobody does. Oops, Deb.
Muted again.
Deb, you're muted.
What is the best
Deb,
time
you're
of year? Am I okay? What's the best time of year to do this? I know you had some concerns doing that. And in our policy, it says that the cycle begins in June. Years ago, when we first started policy governance, we had a meeting and we questioned whether June was a good idea, whether March would be better, and we just landed on June because it happened to already be there. And we said, well, we'll see how it works and change it later if it should be. And I'm suggesting now that we call the end of our year March, or that our year begins in March when we get a new board, for all the reasons that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you are ready to decide whether to do that, and Deb, if you want to make that as a motion, we could certainly handle just that part of the report.
Okay. I move that we define the beginning of our year as March 1st.
Okay, to do that, however, I'm going to have to ask you to suspend the rules because this wasn't on the agenda.
Right.
We suspend the rules.
Okay, moved by Dick to suspend the rules. That takes a 2/3 vote. Is there a second to Dick's motion to suspend the rules to take up what Deb just suggested?
Mm-hmm.
Seconded by Melanie. Is that what you're doing? Okay. All right. All those in favor of suspending the rules, please raise your hand. Looks like we have at least 2/3 there. Okay. Now, Melanie's motion is to, Deb's motion is to have the cycle end in March. And I think what you particularly meant was just before the election in March. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. And is there a second to that? Seconded by Dick.
Should the wording just be the reporting cycle? Because we're not going to affect the fiscal year or anything else. It's just
that's good.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Randy has a question, I think.
I do have a question. Deb, is the motion that it would happen after the election then? Because your March meeting is after the election. And I'm just thinking if the board chair is somebody who's not running for election.
Well, yeah.
Is that time?
I don't know. How do we define that? Because the point that Herb made was that how could we do a review of the last year if the board has changed and some of those people are no longer here, or the chair may have changed?
I think Dick has a suggestion.
It would be due in March. Obviously, the year has not yet concluded. Right. The budget has not yet passed. Right. It would be significant as a summary of all of that stuff. And it would be the responsibility of the outgoing chair to submit that final piece. And that would be an appropriate time.
Right.
Before the election, right?
Yeah.
Correct. And I'm
Right, so
sorry, was
to-
there okay, there is not a second to the motion yet. Is there a second? Okay, seconded by Dick. Any other discussion?
Yeah, it's
Again,
not,
Deb, go ahead.
I was going to say, this really doesn't have anything to do with the fiscal year at all. It's
No.
just,
No, it's strictly the board chair's report.
yeah.
Any other discussion?
No.
Yeah. Okay, all those in favor, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Anybody abstaining, please raise your hand. That passes. I think, Ben, you voted in favor, is that right? Yes, okay. That passes unanimously then. Okay. Future legislative and regulatory action. Jim, is there anything bubbling that you want to tell us about?
There's a lot of activity with task forces, but it's very difficult to read the tea leaves and as to which direction they're going to come out. So I didn't really have an update because I honestly can't give you anything useful.
That's great because we are short of time anyway. Thank you very much. All right, future agenda items. We already have a couple mentioned. One would be the other recommendations in the chair's report. The definition of all students in policy 1.0. I noticed that we don't seem to have followed up on a couple of things we passed last time regarding the snapshot and the VSBA resolution, unless there's been some correspondence I'm not aware of.
There is, but I didn't have it. Frankly, I just felt like it was, I didn't want to raise it in the middle of this meeting, given everything else.
Okay.
But
Well, maybe what you could do, Randy, is if there has been correspondence, do you think you could just send copies to the board so that we know what's?
I don't think that it's necessarily something I would submit. I'm also still waiting on a response. If you went in and looked at the snapshot right now, you would see 19 to 20, and it mostly is NAs, which I'm happy to talk about why that is. And the information that is there, again, is inaccurate, which I'm going back and forth with the state on. So it's not ready, but I'm happy to tell you in summary what I have.
Well, the reason I brought it up was that I think we voted that we should suggest to the agency of ed that they put a warning on their snapshot.
Right, and I said that I was going to communicate with the contact in the middle of September. So I know that you said that, and I think that you should do that, but that's not what I communicated with them. They are maintaining that the information that is there is accurate, and I'm in the middle of explaining to them that it's not and giving them the examples.
Okay.
So.
So maybe an information item for the next agenda then.
Yep, and I also happy to include it in superintendent update.
Yep. Okay. And the other thing was that we passed a motion regarding a VSBA resolution. And we were going to communicate to the VSBA, if I can find it in the minutes. Yeah, it says here, Jim, David, and Jane to draft a VSBA resolution regarding support for vaccination of youth. Has that happened? Jane, could you, are you speaking to that, Jane?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So what I had mentioned to, I think it was Jim, I'm not sure if I told David or anyway, was that in speaking to the president with the Vermont Nurses Association, with the legislature being on recess, they said that they've already had this discussion actually with a couple of nurses that are in the legislature, and that they have their ear and that they really think that this is going to will be proposed. But I've been asked to join part of a group that's going to be actually meeting on Friday to discuss some of the preliminary stuff. And I had mentioned to David and Jim that I think that for now, what I'd recommend is that because the nurses group is feeling like this is going to be a much bigger thing and it's going to involve discussions with many stakeholders, that I think that for now, we don't necessarily have to be bothered, if you will, with taking this on unless people really want to. I think it'll become, because it's already been discussed, I think that there's already been some work done. So I feel like I could come back to Jim and David and let them know where we're at. And
Yeah, does anybody object to doing it that way? I don't see anybody with a hand raised. Okay, so that will just appear on the next agenda for a status, I guess. And Melanie.
Yeah, Jane, just to follow up on that, I know we have not fully discussed that as a board, so that is not anything that as a board I feel like we should be saying that we are a part of. You are doing your work, but not on behalf of the BRC at this point, or the T&G. And just for future items, you brought up SNAP. I don't know if Herb, since we voted on that at the last meeting, is that something that you would craft and send on our behalf? The disclaimer.
Randy spoke to the snapshot.
She spoke to it, but I mean, if we voted that we were going to contact them and ask them to have a disclaimer, I feel like that's something that we said we would do. We as a board.
I agree. We didn't set a deadline for it. And I think Randy's point was that it might be better to tell them that after we've shown them why there should be a disclaimer.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. I understand that. And next, just to add that you'll be at the next meeting for an agenda item, we'll be setting, the board needs to appoint the equity committee to work on that policy. And if the board wants to appoint another member to the policy committee in my stead. And I appreciate you bringing that up in your report. I thought that was very interesting that we do need to actively as a board make sure that we're setting that, not just kind of letting it happen.
Yep, thank you. Okay, I've made notes on that. Anybody else have any additional agenda items? Of course, you can add them at any time. Just contact either Dick or David or me or Randy. Deb. You're muted.
If we finally finish our global ends policy, then that committee will dissolve.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's something we need to do officially or just melt away.
Yeah. And John?
I stepped out to use the bathroom real quick. I apologize if this was said, but are we, is it next meeting or soon are we getting information about our school's enrollment reports and performance data?
Yeah, we don't give enrollment reports typically, but yes, next month is our school goals and SU goals meeting. So we had bumped it because this agenda was so long. We moved it to October.
Can we get enrollment reports for, just seeing for schools where we are and where compared to where we were?
Yes, I can just submit it in the packet if you want, but it's not something we annually do. But I'm happy to put it in if you'd like me to. Mm-hmm. You as a board, I guess I should say.
It seems like it might be helpful. People occasionally do ask.
We're very similar to where we were last year. We're up about 8 students. So it's pretty much spot on, which is lower than it was before that, but I'll send it to you. That was as of a week ago.
Okay, anything else for future agenda items that you can think of right now? Again, there's plenty of opportunity between now and the next meeting if you think of something later. Don't see any. Okay, we need to have a motion to go.
You were going to ask the public if the public had
any
final comments.
That's right, thank you.
And then we were going to go into executive session.
Good point, thank you, Dick.
Well, I just have one question.
Go ahead.
Perhaps you can define in the ends policy, I don't want, what an equity-minded global citizen is. Is that part of what you're going to be looking at?
I would say yes. We do have a definition of equity,
Yes,
but right, and
you insert that from
right,
national equity.
right. One of the things I think an equity committee would consider is, do those two things relate the way that you might think they do, or does one need to be changed? Is one a definition of another?
People know, would a student know what an equity-minded global citizen is?
Not without reading our definition of equity, no. Good point. Good, excellent question. Dick?
The issue of equity is being studied by the superintendent, but it's also, as you've heard unfold, something that we're vitally concerned with, to try and make it as clear as possible what we mean by equity. And so the ends policy that speaks to equity speaks to the need of why we voted to have a new committee to kind of unfold all of that.
Okay, sir, anything else you'd like to comment on before we go into executive session? Okay. All right, thank you very much for sticking it out, too.
I would move that we go into executive session and suspend the reflection on norms in order to discuss the superintendent's evaluation.
Okay, is there a second? Seconded by Melanie. All right, all those in favor of going into executive session, please raise your hand.
And the superintendent be invited.
Yes, thank you. Okay, superintendent's invited.
Superintendent's invited, okay.
Yeah. All right, anybody opposed, raise your hand. Anybody abstaining? Okay, so we'll go into executive session, and this would be only the elected board members plus the superintendent then.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
Sam.
you.
Thank you.
Good night, guys.
Thank you. Good night.
I'm gonna stop recording.
Yeah. Okay, so we have